Sounds good. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. It's a real pleasure for those of us here at the New England Museum Association to be welcoming so many folks from the wider creative community. This is very exciting. So my name is Meg Winnicates. I'm the Director of Engagement for the New England Museum Association, and we've got a great set of panelists here to talk about getting involved in civic engagement and advocacy in this election season. As we are getting started, I have a couple of reminders for folks who've been with us before and some invitations for the rest of you. Would you please introduce yourself in the chat feature? Your name, what organization you're representing, or what creative expression form you yourself use as a person. In the chat feature lets us know where you're coming in from and who else is on the call. This session will be recorded and available afterwards, so it will be hosted on NEMA's YouTube channel. We will also have the link on NEMA's website, and we will be sharing it with the rest of our panelists who will be getting it out through their networks as well. Closed captioning is also available. You can turn that on for yourself at the bottom of the screen. And Heather, did I forget anything?
You're good.
All right, excellent. In that case, I'm going to hand it off to Emily from MassCreative. Thank you so much.
Good morning, all, and thank you, Megan. Thank you, Nima, for hosting us this morning. We are the steering committee of the Create the Vote campaign is really delighted to have you all join us for this conversation, and I want to thank our panelists who are joining us as well. I want to acknowledge that today is the anniversary of the attacks, the 9/11 attacks, and for many people this is a day about memorial and remembering those that we have lost. It's also for many people a day of service and thinking about how we can come together as a community to live in the spirit and honor those who ran towards the emergency and took care of their, took care of their communities in that day. So in that spirit, we want to acknowledge that a lot of the work that we are doing is about taking care of our communities, strengthening democracy, and engaging in civic discourse. And so we're glad to have you this morning for those reasons. Heather, would you mind sharing our screen? Here we are. Okay. So we are going to go. All right. So creating the vote, how to actually take action, right? So I think many of us in this moment are recognizing a greater call for engagement and strengthening democracy. And so we wanted to provide real world and concrete examples about how arts and cultural organizations, as well as individual creative workers, humanists, and artists and culture workers can do that work. So I want to acknowledge the Create the Vote Steering Committee, are your members of which are on the screen right now. And then I want to remind you that it's not too late to pledge to create the vote with us. So in the chat box, there will be a link to take the Create the Vote pledge. And if you haven't already, we hope you'll join us. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit, because sometimes this can be a place where folks get a little anxious, which is if you are a 501c3, what can and can't you do when it comes to census advocacy and election advocacy and voter education work? So 501c3s are by design nonpartisan organizations, right? That's how we keep our tax exempt status. And so in the chat box, we're going to populate a number of different links with additional resources that really do a deep dive into this. But very quickly, the top lines are, here's what 501cs can do. You can encourage your community, your audiences, your patrons, your networks to vote and to engage in the voting process, to check out the candidates running for every office, not just the presidential office, but also thinking about your school committees and your local elections. You can encourage them to research candidates. You can encourage folks to actually go out and vote and make voting plans. You can encourage and advocate and provide education on why the census matters and why folks should participate in the census, help demystify it and ensure people feel safe and that they can take it without there being repercussions. And then finally, you can express and support or oppose opposition or support positions on ballot questions or ballot initiatives. So in almost every election year, you will find that there are some ballot questions that are referendums or a way for laws to be made outside of the legislative process. So a great example of this was 2 years ago, the Yes on 3 question. Question 3 was a referendum on whether or not we should continue to protect our trans neighbors and community members' rights. And so a number of nonprofits actually signed on to a Yes on 3 campaign to continue to provide those protections for trans people. And that is totally allowed. It is considered lobbying, which is an okay thing for nonprofits to do, and Boulder Advocacy has amazing resources to check out to really help you slice and dice exactly what that means. But you can lobby as a 501c3, you just need to be mindful of how much lobbying you're doing, and supporting and expressing support or opposition to ballot questions does fall under that. What you can't do, you cannot endorse or support or share your organization's support for a specific candidate. You cannot make campaign contributions, and that's either writing a check from your nonprofit to a candidate or saying, we'd like to host a fundraiser for you, we're gonna give you the space, we're gonna pay for the catering. You can't do any of that. You also cannot rank or compare candidates on special interest legislation or policies. So as a 501c3, you can't put out a report card and say, candidate X voted for all of these bills that we care about and candidate Y did not. But so that's something that 501c4s can do, but 501c3s cannot. So more information and resources are in the chat box. Let's get into the more important part of the conversation. And Heather, if you can take off the screen, we want to introduce our panelists and start to have our conversation. And I'm joined now by Jay Cottle, who is my co-host. Jay, hello and good morning. Jay is the the executive director of Dynamis, and then also the youth coordinator for MassVOTE. Hi, Jay. How are you?
I'm great. How is everybody else? I'm glad to be here and learn some stuff and share some stories.
So Jay and I are going to ask Karthik and Jesse from Company One, as well as Karen, to join us to talk a little bit about your experiences doing voting and election advocacy. So Karthik and Jesse, you're here too.
Hello, good morning. Happy to be here.
Great. And Karen?
Yeah. Hi there.
So Jesse and Karthik, could you just share briefly how Company One, which is a theater company, thinks about engaging on advocacy around elections and voting?
Karthik, you wanna take that one to start?
Sure. For us, I'm going to speak to the organizational response, and I think Jesse will speak to the programmatic response. It's part of it is actually it's kind of written into the values and culture of the organization at this point, where the program that Jesse is going to talk about actually came out independently, and we just happen to have the pipeline to kind of support that fully. Beyond that, the piece of it that I looked at was what are our resources and assets in this moment beyond being a theater company, and what is our function, what are our strengths in this moment of advocacy. And where we kind of landed was social media was an asset, and we are storytellers. And as we kind of started exploring that, that's where we saw our opportunity to exist at. So what we started getting into was what we call them action posts that lay out and storytell a little bit around what is happening with the census and action folks can take in reasonably simple steps, and also what we can do in terms of elections. I'm just going to quickly share a post here. Second. Sorry, I do this Here you go. And this is an example of storytelling and using our social media to kind of talk about the state primary. What we recognized in particular was there was a lot of different things going on in relation to the state primary. And me and Tyler, our marketing person, ended up having to have quite a little bit of conversations to kind of navigate and figure out what the storytelling was going to look like, and if it can be clear about the deadlines and the action items kind of associated with it. And these were 3 posts that we put together in one thing that specifically talked about how you get to voting around state primary. And what we started seeing was as long as we cleaned up the narrative and if we leaned into our strength of engaging with a little bit of drama, we were actually seeing a fair amount of advocacy on the back end with this post. And with that, I'll hand it off to Jesse.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what Karthik's talking about is sort of the ways that the kind of company structures can be used for advocacy, but then our programming is sort of hand in hand with that. And so Company One's mission is about building community at the intersection of art and social change. And so one of the things I do is sort of take the mission and the logistics that Karthik is working on and then put those into practice through art and programming with our really excellent staff. And so the most recent example of that is our event called The Great Demand, which we did last month to sort of commemorate and grapple with the anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And so, you know, we had some conversation as a connectivity team about like how we wanted to mark this anniversary, which felt notable, but also I think frequently a lot of people are left out of the conversation around women's suffrage specifically and sort of the history of voting rights. And so Company One is always trying to, you know, make the biggest table possible and create as kind of inclusive a space as we can in these conversations. And so in these conversations about how we wanted to mark that anniversary, I think what kind of came together really pretty fast, it was a very quick turnaround, but what came together was a sort of like multi-department event where we have this really excellent program that's run by our dramaturgy team and our resident playwright Kirsten Greenwich called Play Lab. And we have a team of writers every year who are part of the unit. And so what we decided to do was kind of pitch them a couple of prompts, have all of the writers that we invited to do that write just a very short 5-minute play on prompts around voting and voting rights. And then, so we were sort of building on a pre-existing program that was already there to kind of engage in this question of advocacy through art. But then we always pair our art with something actionable. And so my job on the connectivity team as a creative producer is I do a lot, you know, when in non-COVID times, a lot of what I'm doing is organizing our post shows and our events that happen around our programming through kind of like thematic lenses. And so using some of the connections that we've built previously, we were able to kind of bring community organizers in to do little short sessions between those plays, talking about, you know, what their different organizational focuses were in terms of voting, and sort of tie the plays, these like really tiny short plays and the themes that they were talking about into really specific action steps for folks, and sort of like condense that into a kind of a very tight program that was super clear. So that was something that, you know, was kind of an all hands on deck event for our company. It sort of leaned on the abilities of lots of different departments. It wasn't just an artistic program in some ways, it was also engagement and marketing, and all of the different pieces had to come together to make that work. But I think that's ultimately why it was super successful, is because everybody had some investment in it.
Jesse, you talked about how that program in particular was interdepartmental, and Karthik, you mentioned that you guys have kind of gotten adept at weaving this kind of work into the work of Company One. A lot of organizations struggle with the capacity piece, right? They maybe want to pivot into more civic engagement advocacy, but they feel like it's difficult. Can you talk really briefly about how you guys were able to do that and the challenges or successes you've seen in adding that into the everyday life of your organization?
Yeah, I can start and then I'll toss it over to Karthik. I mean, I do think one of the reasons that we were able for this particular event to kind of pull it off on a tight turnaround and with, you know, I think pretty good success, is that we had relationships and structures in place to make it happen that had taken a few seasons to build. And so that this isn't overnight work, it takes some time. And so if anybody hasn't done that work yet, that's not to say you can't. It just is gonna, you have to start at some point, and then it kind of, I think, gets easier as you go, because you're kind of building relationships and you get the practice of how to kind of quickly mobilize to have these conversations when you need to have them after you've kind of been in the conversation for a minute. So, we were able to pull in some of the community organizers who participated because we had invited them for past events, or we had attended events that they had hosted. And so those conversations are really long-term conversations, and it's about relationship building. Anytime you're kind of talking about your community and how civic engagement intersects with your community, I think you have to be part of that community. And so I think it will be more authentic if you are, as an organization and as people working in an organization, part of that community 365 days a year, not just like the one day you want to do an event, is sort of, I think, one of the reasons it was successful.
Yeah, and if I can kind of pick up that thread, even as we start kind of getting into the advocacy and action posts, something we recognize pretty quickly is we don't have to reinvent the wheel from scratch. There's a lot of great organizations, both advocacy and 501c3s, who are doing really great work. It's about just amplifying, and to quote my predecessor, Sarah Champlain, was managing director before me, sometimes it's just about, if you're the only platform that people are hearing something through, it is worth doing and worth amplifying, even if it is 2 to 5 people, as long as everyone's credited and you're pointing to the folks who actually did the work. So that's the easy left piece of it. And kind of speaking to the systems piece of it, what we've discovered is it's really hard only the first time. If you don't think about it as a one-off, but if you think about it as a structure and a container, our first action post that we put up actually happened in the wake of the George Floyd murder. And we were pointing to a little bit of the advocacy that was going around Defund the Police, done by Families for Justice Healing, Muslim Justice League, and Asian American Resource Workshop. And putting together that first post and pointing to work that they were doing, trying to kind of figure out a structure was a lift. And it was like a multi-layered conversation. But once that happened and we had a term for it and a system and a container for it, the progressive posts became a lot easier because we saw the kind of impact it was having. And then once you have vocabulary and you have a process set up, then it's really about, in our case, I believe that most, if not a lot of the people in the arts are civically engaged anyway, and are passionate and have deep opinions about it. It's just creating a better framework to filter those opinions and kind of figure out how you do your public messaging. And part of it is leadership, I think, has to kind of put in that work to create that framework.
Thank you both. And we will have a Q&A at the end, so not to worry. I'm sure folks are interested to hear more from both of you and hear more about Company One's work. I want to transition and introduce Karen Risteben, who is a practicing artist and arts and cultural leader on the North Shore. And Karen, you were moved to action to actually become a poll worker this year. Can you tell us a little bit about why you made that decision?
Well, there's a need. A lot of the poll workers who traditionally man and women are polls are elderly, older, and so many of them are at risk for in the COVID scenarios. So I know there was a real need, and I just wanted to learn more about what happened on the inside of polls and counting votes, and do my tiny part, to make sure that the process was equitable and fair. So I volunteered. I live in Gloucester, so I reached out to the City Hall election office and got the very simple one-page application and just volunteered to work at polls. So I worked on primary day. They assigned me to actually a couple of days in the early voting process, worked at City Hall, and then worked on primary day. And it was great training for the general election. So I'll go on, and I've got several days during the early voting, 2 weeks in Gloucester, volunteering for that, and then I'm working on Election Day as well. It was really amazing to just be part of the process. During one of the early voting days at City Hall, I ended up working with an 87-year-old woman who's got amazing energy. I hope I'm doing what she's doing at 87. She's been working the polls for 30 years, and she's was unconcerned about the health risks. Everyone wore masks all day long. You know, you have to be masked. There was plenty of distance between us all on both the early voting process and on the primary day. And I came away feeling like the process is sound, you know, and that there are so many checks and balances in the process. Additional ones this year because there are so much more, you know, statewide early voting available to people. So the workers who had been working for years in this were a little bit flummoxed by the fact that there was so many early voting ballots coming in, both mailed in and being dropped off in the process. So there was that added another element of complexity to what everyone was doing. But I came away, and I think everyone else did too, by the end of primary day, thinking, all right, this is a sound vote, and there are so many different ways to account for it. So it was very interesting. You know, I was assigned as an inspector, which is just the person who I had the voting roster, and I was, you know, checking people off all day and handing out either a Democratic or a Republican ballot to people. Everyone in the voting roster had a check mark if they had been mailed an early voting ballot. That was checked off. So we had that was in place. I was able to determine whether they had actually mailed it in or whether they had not mailed it in and were coming in to either drop off their ballot, in which case I was at Gloucester High School. We had to send them to City Hall to drop it off that day of primary day, or they could choose to destroy that early ballot and sign an affidavit, a very simple form, very quick in the process, to sign to say that they were not going to be doing two ballots, that they were just going to be voting in person. So I was there with a clerk and a warden and a constable and other inspectors during the day. We worked from 6:30 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. On primary day, and that'll be the case, you know, at least those hours for election day. But I'm signed up to do it, and I'm just happy to do it. You know, I'm healthy. And the other thing is too, I've got a pretty public profile here on the North Shore and through Essex County because of my job with Essex County Community Foundation. I'm engaged with a lot of people and on social media a lot. So I just figured if I can do the work, model it, you know, and maybe inspire some other people to volunteer in their communities as well. It's the very least I can do. So that's it.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and hopefully more people take your example. And poll workers also get paid too. So volunteering, or maybe need a little side hustle, I think that's another way to think about it. There's 2 weeks of early voting for this next election, so there's even more time to get involved for sure. Thank you again, Karen. So the other thing that's coming up now, we're in the final stages of the census. So the census is closing out at the end of this month. And so we wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about how Arts have been speaking to that piece as well. We have Elena from Arts Boston. If you could talk a little bit about what your work has been doing around the census.
Yeah, hi. So we've been doing a couple different things with the census currently. And back in February, we actually had an event partnered with MassCreative and MassVOTE Table that was actually headed up by Audrey, who's about to join us and speak. Hey, Audrey. And yeah, so that event was called Census 101 for art workers, and we were talking with Beth just about how arts organizations specifically can get involved with the census, and she had a really great quote that I just want to repeat, which was that the census is a chance for all of our communities to tell the story of who they are. So for us as an arts service organization, I think linking the census and the work that happens around the census, whether it's distribution of resources or political redistricting, that is all part of the storytelling of our community. So it really kind of links that to the way that we can engage as artists and as art service organizations in general. And I am curious to hear what Audrey has to say as well, but one of the things that we've been putting out are a couple blog posts with resources about how to stay involved in advance of the deadline of September 30th, which is coming up pretty soon. So I will put those in the chat briefly, but one of the things I've been doing personally as well has just been phone banking and text banking. And that's when you're able to just call and text through a system with either, MassVOTE is doing phone banking, MassVoter Table is doing phone banking. There's a lot of different ways that you can get involved. And that is just a great way to have conversations with people who may be in hard to count areas, maybe people who are just having a hard time filling out the census. And I've had some great conversations with folks. So it really is a great way to get involved. But yeah, I'll put a couple of those links in the chat for everybody, but that is a lot of the stuff that we've been doing over at Arts Boston.
I not to be a Debbie Downer here, but I unfortunately read the most recent update regarding our census participation in Massachusetts, and we're not doing well, friends. So this is, and Elena, you mentioned that the census is linked directly to how federal resources are allocated across the country. And they're also used to think about redistricting in the, Audrey, I'm gonna steal your thunder for just a second because you were the one who reminded me of this a couple weeks ago, is that in the last census, in the 2010 census, we actually lost a seat in Congress because of the census count. So for everyone on this call, this is a place that is sort of like, there's an immediate need. And as Elena, you mentioned, there are a lot of ways to get involved. So I'd like to introduce Audrey Seraphin. Audrey, hello and welcome. We're so glad to have you on the line. So Audrey has been involved in a passionate census advocate and worker.
True.
Yeah, and now you are also the director of a Spark for the city of Boston, and you also are part of the Front Porch Arts Collective. So you wear many hats. Could you share a little bit about what the census means to you and why you chose that as a place where you wanted to sort of deepen your engagement and involvement?
Yeah, so the census is not something I knew really a whole lot about probably like 18 months ago, and actually through meeting Beth Wong, who directs and engaging with her, she's fantastic at MassVoter Table. And actually, like, weirdly, my dad he's a software engineer, and he was contracted by the Census Bureau to help develop the app that I actually use now to enumerate. So yeah, it's just like been a huge part of like kind of my family life, weirdly, for like the last 2-ish years, because they've been working on it for a long time. But the census is really important. I remember meeting census advocate at like a theater after party thing that Front Porch was doing, and she was saying, she said to me, like, the census is more important than voting. And I was like, wow, that's like a really big statement. But I've actually come to definitely agree with her, because when you vote, you are determining the next 4 years or 6 years maximum if you're voting for a senator to represent you. When you fill out the census, you are determining federal funding and representation for the next 10 years. So if you think about like the impact of that, it is super far reaching. It's as you mentioned, I've been enumerating with the census before I started this new job, and it was a great source of income when I was unemployed, and it was it's kind of been like sort of this central tenet in my life, and it's just like one of those things that doesn't sound very like sexy or interesting, but like is actually so incredibly important. And I've been really lucky to have some of the best people at the city and inside and outside the arts to work on all of these things. So right now at Spark, we're doing some demystifying around the census. I've been working as a census worker. We have another council member. Spark Boston is the mayor's Millennial and Gen Z Civic Engagement Council volunteers, 40 volunteers between the ages of 20 and 35 promoting civic engagement in the city of Boston. So I've been working as an enumerator. One of our other council members has been working as an enumerator. And we're trying to just say that, like, yes, we're knocking on your door during a pandemic, but it is quite important that you open it because we're wearing a mask and we have a lot of hand sanitizer and we will not touch you. And it is just like it's a 10-minute conversation that impacts the next 10 years of your community. Or it's a 10-minute, if you do it online, then you don't have to talk to anybody. You can call. But it's been a really fascinating to walk around the neighborhoods that I have not been walking around very much before during the pandemic, and meeting all of my neighbors, essentially, who are, there are people who don't speak English. There are immigrant and multi-generational homes with, upwards of 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 people in them, so it's definitely, there are, more challenging cases for enumerators to deal with. So if you know somebody who is, and there was a lot of fear around the citizenship question, which was actually not even included on the census, but just the, stir up around that. And if you wanted, basically all the reasons that like people are upset right now about the state of democracy and want to vote, all of those also apply to the census. Our current president has curtailed census operations. We were supposed to conclude on October 31st and are being forced to conclude on September 30th, pending an injunction by a federal court, but like unclear. That'll get resolved on the 17th of September, so stay tuned about that. But like that is something to be tweeting about, that is something to be upset about, that is something to talk to your representatives about. It's just as much as anything else. The way that the census this year was designed is to try to limit the participation of communities of color, and to historically undercounted communities, which include immigrants, young people, renters, folks who move around a lot. So the key date to remember is April 1st. That was Census Day. And we're just trying to get a count of where everybody was on that day, regardless of whether or not they, non-voters can participate in the census. You don't have to be a citizen. So basically anyone who is living here on April 1st for any reason, we need to make sure that there is federal funding and support available for them where they are.
Go ahead, Emily.
No, I think you go, Jay.
I was just going to say thank you, Audrey, for the very important work that you're doing. As both you and Elena mentioned, the census has very widespread ramifications in terms of support, in terms of funding, in terms of how our districts are drawn. One last piece on the security aspect for folks that are worried, since that comes up a lot, especially in our communities of color, our communities a lot with non-citizens, is that census data is confidential for 72 years. And so the individual household data is confidential, is protected, and cannot be used against these families. So please encourage people that it is safe to fill out the census, because that is another aspect of the conversation. And speaking about just general civic engagement, we want to talk again about how different organizations have been doing that work over a long period of time. And we want to start by talking with Marquis, the founder and executive director of Elevated Thought, to talk a little bit more about that.
Hey, thank you for having me. Grateful to be here. I'm Marquis, he, him, Elevated Thought, art and social justice based in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Love this state, love these people that I've been able to get to know a little bit on the steering committee here. We actively address systematic oppression through creative youth development, beautification projects, youth organizing, and paid opportunities for BIPOC creatives. So our work around voting isn't so grandiose, because everything that we do at Elevated Thought, it really starts with conversation and getting a sense of where our young people are at and their understanding about particular themes, particular structures and makeups in the society that they live in. So we've really been starting internally with our young people, asking them like what they think about voting. Do they know anything about voting? Are they interested in learning more, and using that as a baseline to their understanding? And what we came to realize is that there was a tremendous amount of indifference for our young people, and just a general lack of the basics when it comes to the history of voting in this country. And this in maybe subtle ways and more explicit ways, voter suppression got brought up. And so we as an organization were like, all right, young people in these different forms are talking about how they feel that, as Black and brown folks in these communities, their voices don't count. It doesn't matter if they vote, because nothing's going to change. And so how we start is, you can bring up Frederick Douglass, who was a huge advocate for women's voting rights, never mind, Black liberation. So we start with somebody like Frederick Douglass, have a conversation around him. And, this isn't something where like, you need to vote, this is why. We want to have a discussion, because young people also were clear on, they've been told to vote by other people, and they haven't been given a reason or understanding why they should vote. So we use somebody like Frederick Douglass as an example to talk about why he was so intent on the polls and voting, and then you can connect that to MLK. You know, MLK was very explicit about, hey, JFK is not getting that presidential election without the Black vote. That's clear. He won by a margin of 10,000 votes. That's 10,000 Black votes right there, and that's why he got in there. So, you know, these concrete examples, these people that they're somewhat familiar with, that they can connect to, and we can have a conversation about, that tends to evoke more questions within the young people. They want to know more. Okay, so in a place like Massachusetts, a place like Lawrence, how does voting affect us? It's not just about presidents, it's not about these people at the top. You're voting your voice. If you want change, we got to start seeing that in your community, right? Locally. So what does that look like? I'm not old enough to vote. Why should I care? Because you're gonna be old enough to vote pretty soon. And these are conversations that, you know, look at the interest that you have in this topic, this knowledge that we're investigating together. This is information that you can share with your family. You know, a lot of these young people, my family doesn't have time to talk about voter suppression because they got to work their 2 to 3 jobs. We got to get money on the table. You know, they just want to be safe, and they want to take care of their family. Well, you know, so let's talk about how voting can change what safety means for your family and your people, right? So all this creates a greater conversation, and this conversation translates into creativity. And so our young people created a wide range of infographics and cool visuals to encourage people to have this conversation about voting, and also, you know, deeper level voter suppression. So just an example real quick, I'm gonna pull my screen down. This is a shirt that one of our young artists created, and voter suppression, and we collaborated with this company 195 Essentials, who's doing a lot of work around voter suppression and creating awareness on why voting matters. They're based out of Boston, in addition to working with you know, Create the Vote 2020 and ECCF, and providing some graphics for them to use and share throughout the Commonwealth, just to, you know, because we believe art, you know, outside of these anecdotes, this hardcore information, this history, art can just be a starting point to those conversations. Look at that graphic, look at those words underneath it. Let's have a conversation about it. Let's begin to raise our consciousness so we can share that raised consciousness across the community. So that's the work that we've been doing over the past couple months.
Marquis, thank you. I got so excited by your T-shirt that I was speechless. Can I just ask too, Marquis? So I love how you're talking about, right, like at the heart and soul of your organization is creative youth development and community organizing, and how by working with young people in their interests, and then with that ripple effect out to their families, out to their communities. Are you sort of, I guess this is anecdotally, are you as a practitioner in an organization sort of seeing the discourse around elections and voting sort of increase in your community because of the work that you're doing?
I could just speak for young people that are connected to ET. We, as of right now, we have eight people throughout, I think it's 5 different families that have voted for the first time this year. So, you know, things like that, we're excited about. In terms of the broader community, that's, you know, it's a bit more nuanced, you know, creating these conversations are having more frequently, at least the conversations that are young people connected to. But we like to think, hey, that's 8 people that they're going to feel empowered and have a voice. And for us, it's always, if one person does that, to us, that's a success, because we got to start somewhere. So, you know, we just want to, and hopefully next year we do this again, we can double, triple that, and, you know, get more people engaged in supporting this work that we're trying to share across the community.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Marquis. Also, a PSA for everyone. In Massachusetts, you can pre-register to vote when you are 16 or 17 years old. So if any of you who are on the line work with young people, that's another piece of the equation to lift up and remind us of. So now we are joined by Cassandra, who is the executive director of the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum in Adams, Massachusetts. Cassandra, thank you for joining us. And would you share a little bit about how your organization's approach to civic engagement and civic life?
Yes. So as a history museum, our board of directors decided that our organization would really just focus on the historical period from 1820 to 1920. So I often have to be creative about how I connect what we talk about in our museum to what's actually happening on the ground in the local community and nationally. So one of the things that's been really exciting the past couple of years is in the town of Adams, there's an organization called Vote for Susan. And it's grassroots. Some local community people sort of created this branding. They have pins that they sell that say Vote for Susan. They have yard signs that say Susan couldn't, but you can vote. And so those are actually things that we display at the museum, and they have increased voter turnout in the town of Adams. I think last year they increased by about 50%, and then this year, I don't know if the numbers are in. And a lot of them are participating in the actual polling stations and the voting stations. And it's something that, because it's such a fun slogan, people who visit us from out of state collect those items, and it encourages them to vote. It encourages teenagers to vote. It's really great when people come and their name is Susan, because of course they buy those things. We actually had a state representative from another state who came, and her name was Susan. We sort of take the track of talking about what went right in the U.S. suffrage movement, women's suffrage movement, and what went wrong, sort of looking back. So trying to talk with people about what lessons we can take from events that happened long enough ago that we sort of have 2020 retrospective vision. And that's something that we try to talk about even with fifth graders, so that they can think about the structures that are in place now and how voting rights or civil rights in, say, 1870 might be different today, or what still needs to change. We also work with little artists, and that's, for us, that's a really great way to take something that's creative, that isn't necessarily directly rooted in modern politics, but that gives people in the area a way to address what's happening and process what's happening. So like right now I'm working with a local playwright who wrote a musical about women's suffrage. And so there are songs in there about women's voting rights. And we're talking about running a workshop for people to come in and sort of write their own new old suffrage ballads. And while we as people are going to be very much talking about, you know, what was happening in the late 19th and early 20th century, we're expecting people to come in thinking about what's happening right now and what do they want to address in poems, in ballads. And then, of course, one of our big efforts over the past couple of years, which was really started by one of our high school interns, is, first of all, thinking about the fact that historical figures are often turned into larger-than-life myths. But they were real people, and they had real flaws, and they had real bias. And so addressing that, you know, Susan B. Anthony is one of those people where she has this huge name, she has this huge reputation, and so looking back sort of with a grain of salt and seeing what can we do better as humans today. And then, of course, the mainstream narrative of the U.S. women's suffrage movement is very white and very middle class. And so trying to bring in those voices that have been silenced, sometimes on purpose, in the history of the U.S. women's suffrage movement, and also the people who were discouraged from participating in parades in 1913, and who do we not learn about in school. So even just getting engagement on Instagram, on Facebook, for us, our Facebook is a lot of local people, and Instagram is a lot of people in other parts of the country. So for us, that's a way that we can, remind people that what you see sort of on the surface level of a story, there are going to be so many more people working behind the scenes. There are going to be so many more essays and speeches and perspectives that you don't learn about. So for us, we're really trying to use the history to create a parallel for what's happening today.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Cassie. And thank you for sort of illustrating the various ways that you can use history and to make connections to the present. I want to also just lift up, they weren't able to join us on the line today, but the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, which is located in Boston, does an enormous amount of work around government and governance. And so they have embarked and launched a Just Vote campaign. And Meg from NEMA is going to join us with a statement from EMKI on that work.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, Caroline Burke at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate sends her apologies. Everybody there, all the part-time folks have been entirely furloughed, all the full-time folks have been furloughed to part-time, and she had no hours left in her work week this week to be able to join us today. But she sent along a note specifically about their Just Vote campaign, but some of the other things that they're doing as well. Just Vote grew out of, they were actually planning an in-person exhibit that was due to open in the middle of the arrival of the pandemic. So they have built it into a much bigger nationwide virtual exhibit and messaging campaign, etc. So Caroline encourages anyone to please go ahead and reach out to her if you've got any questions or if you would like to get involved in the Just Vote campaign, because they're actively looking for partners, etc. So this is what she has to say. She says, the Edward M. Kennedy Institute is, by its very mission statement, dedicated to building civic engagement and understanding in all of our visitors and inspiring others to become our next generation of leaders. There has never been a more important moment for our organization to work at fulfilling this mission than today, with a pandemic that is laying bare the economic and healthcare disparities of this nation and underscoring the importance of voter participation. In this current environment, the Kennedy Institute has activated several programs and campaigns to support voter participation and civic engagement in all of our visitors. The Just Vote campaign, website, resources, and partner links to help people of all ages understand how to vote, why to vote, and the important historical and contemporary context of the struggle for enfranchisement in this country. We are actively seeking partners and resources to include and link to in acknowledgement that there are many of us joined in this effort. There's also Today's Vote in the Classroom, which is a program that as the school year launches, we are happy to release a full suite of public policy focused programs that educators and students can participate in together without needing to visit the Institute. They normally do this in person in their replica of the Senate chamber so that they talk about whatever issues are actually being debated on the Senate floor that day, and you get an opportunity to vote yourself and see how it turns out and how you line up with the votes that actually happen in the Senate. It's very, very cool if you get to do it in person. Ranging in topics from electoral college reform and immigration policy to food labeling, intellectual property in the digital age, and criminal justice reform, this national program is available free to all. It introduces participants to the process of legislating, provides role play opportunities, and encourages analysis of issues that affect all of us on a daily basis. They are also continuing to offer Zoom-based virtual public programs on an almost weekly basis, and they are going to be doing facilitated virtual programming and in-person tours of the Institute starting in October. So they are going to be launching Just Vote publicly next week. So you guys are getting a little bit of a preview today. We do have a Boston Globe article. Thank you very much, Alina, for popping that into the chat if you're interested in reading some more about it. And she did say she was very disappointed not to be able to attend, but again, please feel free to reach out to her for more details or to get involved.
Thanks so much, Megan. Thanks to our friends over at the Edward Kennedy Institute. So the last piece that we're going to talk about today is really uplifting how individuals can get active in the civic engagement process. So if we can share the screen with the PowerPoint. One thing that came out a few months ago, right after the kind of social uprisings were happening was that a lot of young people in particular were watching these very visible things happen, these very visible protests happening, and a lot of people began to wonder, like, am I not doing enough if I'm not out in the streets? Is that where I belong? And there was kind of a guilt that was happening with some folks about how best to engage and to meet this moment. And a lot of those conversations, I wanted to uplift a couple different things. If we could skip forward a few slides. Can I skip the slides? Do I have that power? I do, I think. Okay, great. Come back to that in a moment. And so there's something called a movement ecology. And that basically says whenever you're trying to make change, whenever there's a part of a movement, there are multiple ways to get involved and multiple ways to be active that are necessary and symbiotic and require each other. The first is mass protest, and that's very disruptive. It's large. Its point is to bring awareness to issues. And as we just said, that was the Black Lives Matter protest. It was the March on Washington, the March for Our Lives. A very, very important part of building a movement. The next is leveraging dominant institutions, and that's when you can use and or reform systems that exist already to bring justice. That's things like voting. That's community organizing. That's trying to change laws or politics. It's the defund the police initiative that's going on right now. And then you have alternatives. How can we imagine a better way, a fuller way of living and being to then re-inspire change in other folks? And that's things like co-ops or alternative medicine or police abolition. And then lastly, and this is my personal favorite as an educator, is personal transformation. How do we actually change people, behaviors, and biases? And that happens through education, conversation, and this internal work. And so sometimes if you feel like, you're watching this mass protest stuff happen, or you're watching folks, get out and be organizers and do that stuff, all of that is important, but there are other ways of going about this work that are just as vital. How are those conversations you have around your dinner table, the internal work you do to look at your own biases and the own issues that you have is key. And I think as creatives in particular, we have to be imagining alternatives. We can keep talking about how the world isn't right, but we also have to make space for what we want it to be. And as the creatives that exist in this world, we should be really tapping into the power of our imagination in particular to think of a better way of moving the world forward. So I'm going to put in the chat, if you want to learn more about IME, you can learn more about movement ecologies in there. The next piece is, it's impossible to be responsible for everybody. The work that we do is important, and trying to uplift the message as much as we can is vital. However, you can't make sure that 9,000 people have gone to the polls. What you can control is maybe 5. So I have 4 of my really close friends and my mom, and those are the people. Have you done your census? Have you voted? Where are you voting? Who are you voting for? And they know to come to me and say, what does this mean? What are we doing? So really think critically about who are the 5 people that you're going to activate and be on and make sure that they're doing their part in this process. And if all of us do that, I think our reach can be a lot wider. I'm going to go backwards a little bit to talk about some upcoming things that are very important that you can be plugging into. So coming up in just a few weeks is National Voter Registration Day on September 22nd. We have as we mentioned before, the census deadline is on September 30th. October 24th is the deadline to register to vote in Massachusetts if you are trying to vote in the November election. Folks can always register. Those deadlines are just about which elections they can participate in terms of deadlines. Early voting, as I mentioned earlier, is actually happening over the course of 2 weeks this election season, and that's from October 17th to the 30th. As we get a little bit closer, each city and town across the Commonwealth will release where those are happening and when those are going to be happening. And then lastly, the mail-in ballot application deadline is going to be October 28th. So for folks who voted by mail in the primary, there was an option to request both of your ballots, to request your primary ballot as well as your general ballot. So if you did that piece, you're not going to see anything for a little bit because you're just going to get your ballot when it comes. If you did not on that form say that you wanted both your ballots, maybe you only chose for the primary, the next week you're going to get another application for mail-in ballots again that will allow you to request your general election ballot. And then on November 3rd, there is Election Day. Okay. The next piece is that This year, in addition to early voting, we have some ballot questions that are going to be on the ballot. The first is the right to repair. I'm really not going to try to explain this too much because I don't drive, guys. I take the T like a champ, and now I Uber. But actually, I stay home because we're in quarantine. So that is the right to repair that typically exists. That is a law that exists already that people are trying to get updated to include kind of the more technology and wireless pieces to kind of update that language. And question 2 is about trying to implement ranked choice voting, which would allow folks to choose literally more than one candidate when they're voting and rank them by preference. There's another link again to be a poll worker. And lastly, if you're interested in phone banking and things you mentioned before, there's another way to sign up for MassVOTE as we run a steady slew of phone banks. In the last minute or two of this conversation, we'd love to hear from folks about what's worked for them, either as individuals or as organizations, and kind of in weaving the civic engagement practice into their lives or their work. If anyone would like to share in the last few minutes. Or if you have any questions about anything you've heard today. Elena, you're on mute.
Thank you. I'm not seeing too many questions in the chat or the Q&A, but feel free to pop them in there right now in our last few minutes. I did see one from Betsy Loring that says, what do you about the 8 that will talk about their experience to others who've never voted? Betsy, if you want to unmute and ask a question about that, I think that was when Marquis was talking about getting out the vote with young people.
Yeah, no, that was just a comment, not a question. But it was really like you saying, well, it's only 8, but those 8 people, at least half of them are going to talk to somebody they know about their experience, and that helps demystify it for first-time voters. So I think you can count more than 8 in that number.
Yeah, that's great. If anybody else wants to make a comment or share about any of your voting advocacy action steps that you're taking with your organization, just feel free to unmute or raise your hand. And we are still looking like we don't have too many more questions there, but
you'll actually have to, this is Heather, you'll have to raise your hand so I can unmute you and stuff like that. So definitely feel free to do that. And so we do have a person here, Kathy Saunders.
Oops. With the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And oh, am I still muted? Can you hear me?
You're good, Betsy. I mean,
Kathy. Sorry, it says it's muted. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. New Bedford Whaling Museum, and we have a historic women's project, and we've decided we're going to take local women and sort of do a Why I Vote social media campaign and push those out. So, but featuring the idea of getting local women that all have big networks, so that way. Sort of trying to get that message out. So rather than it just being the national voices, it being local voices.
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing about that. And I do see one more question here. Who are some organizations that nonprofits may be able to partner with to curate a more dynamic voting dynamic within their specific community? I'm not sure, Jay or Emily, if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, Emily knows everybody in the state. She's like, her Rolodex is much deeper than mine. But I for sure would lift up MassVoter Table, who you've heard about before, MassVOTE. A lot of their work is about working with other organizations to help them build out or support that civic engagement work in their own practices. But Emily can probably speak to some more local folks in various communities. And then also, of course, MassCreative. I mean, there's them. So.
Jay, you are too kind. I would also say, to answer that question, we will, following this webinar, we'll send out a number of different resources to point you in the direction of. There's actually a Safe Elections network that's spearheaded by the MassVoter Table and MassVOTE that provides a number of different resources. And I believe they're having a town hall next week to sort of help sort of set the table as we go into the general election. So we'll make sure you get those resources. If I may invoke moderator privilege, I think one of the things that oftentimes when we talk to arts and cultural organizations and leaders, there's always a little concern about, ooh, if we get too political, we're gonna lose audience members, we're gonna lose donors. And I'd love to hear from some of the groups that are our panelists about if you can actually share how engagement on this work has actually strengthened your organization, or provided benefits that you didn't expect but have been really great to you and your work. Jessie, would you share a little bit about that?
Sure thing. So I have a funny position at Company One where I wear lots of hats, and one of my other hats, in addition to being creative producer and working in engagement and dramaturgy, is I also do a lot of our development admin. And so one of the things that I noticed after our Great Demand event is that we had, we pivoted, like so many other people did, to doing all digital online programming over the summer because of the pandemic. And we had started letting folks do donations through our online platform for all of our programming, which had worked really well. And then when we did the Great Demand, the huge uptick in donations that we got for that event was really remarkable. And I think that's probably for a few reasons. One of the reasons is because so many folks were involved in that event. And so just, having more participants means that more of their networks are watching and participating and possibly donating a few bucks when they RSVP. But I also think that there's something about the content of the programming that was compelling to people, that, that engaging in questions around voting, and that providing something really actionable and concrete that you can sort of come to the event and take away with. People think that that's valuable. So I think for me, that was an indication, as somebody who kind of works on the development side and also on the programming side, that more of that kind of programming is probably what people are hungry for based on the response that we saw. So that was really heartening. And then I think, I'm sure Karthik can kind of speak a little bit about the social media response as well, but we've seen definitely an uptick in engagements in our posts because of some of the things that we've done recently around action steps. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Karthik?
Yeah, I think speaking to, we've been also tracking our social media just analyzing the kind of impact we're having on social media, because everyone moved to a very digital space at this moment. And similar to what Jessie said, posts that generally deal with advocacy and civic engagement have been doing better in some ways than traditional marketing posts for sure. And we've seen an uptick in follower increase, uptick in engagements, which just has been supporting the brand conversation, has been supporting a whole slew of other conversations as part of that.
Thank you for that. All in the chat box, there's also this great comment from Olivia Feel about Olivia works with a campus museum and how they are doing deep engagement work with student affairs through a social media campaign and student groups around voting for out-of-state students. So there are many different ways and many different pieces of this advocacy work that need attention. We are at time, so I want to just take a beat and thank our panelists and thank the broader community of all of you who joined this call. It is through our work together in collaboration and coalition that change is affected, and so each of us has a role to play in this work. And Jay, thank you so much for providing that structure and matrices to think about the various roles we can play. We will follow up with all of you, we promise. And I want to thank Nima, especially for hosting us this morning. I want to thank Stage Source and Rosalind, the new program manager, for her leadership in putting this event together as part of the Create the Vote Steering Committee. So thank you all. Have wonderful days. I hope you get a moment to get outside this weekend and enjoy fall sweater weather. It's here. So thank you very much. And we look forward to engaging with all of you further on elections and the census. All right, have great days.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everybody.